Every parent has a set way in which they want to raise their children. However, in the case of the Stockdale family of Beach City, Ohio, the bizarrely strict house rules might have directly contributed to innocent people losing their lives. The strangest thing about the Stockdale family massacre is that we don't know the motive. The perpetrator has yet to mention why he did what he did, and police have been quiet on those details. In spite of all of that, we'll try to unpack the gruesome details of the Stockdale family massacre today. It's a case that reveals just how much darkness can be hiding beneath the surface of a seemingly happy family, and how that darkness can build up and violently explode without any warning. The Stockdales were a deeply religious family that decided to move away from the city. Tim and Kathy Stockdale wanted their children to internalize wholesome Christian values, and they felt like the best way to do this was to isolate their children from the real world. The family moved to a remote farm in Beach City, Ohio, where they raised their 4 sons, Calvin, Charles, Jacob, and James. By all accounts, Kathy was a very strict mother. She instituted a series of rules that the boys had to follow. Otherwise, they'd be punished, and she rewarded them for following the rules with meager prizes like being able to listen to a radio show. That's not to say that the family was completely without joy, of course. Kathy and Tim loved bluegrass music, and their children showed a lot of musical promise from a young age. Jacob, especially, became a fiddle-playing prodigy, learning how to play the instrument at the age of 7 and mastering it before he hit puberty. As a result of his talent, Jacob won awards all across Ohio. He even became Ohio State Grand Fiddle Champion in 2012, a few years after a certain event that likely seeded the homicides to come. The Stockdales eventually formed a family band, with Calvin playing the banjo, Charles the mandolin, James on the upright bass, and Jacob on the fiddle. Of course, their father Tim fronted the band on guitar and as the main vocalist, though all of the sons sang. However, the boys didn't have much to enjoy apart from the family band. Their parents didn't allow them to watch TV, play video games, listen to most types of music, or even make friends with anyone outside of the family. Kathy saw dating as a physical danger to her children since she was worried that they might get someone pregnant and prohibited them from talking to any girls. This meant that the supposedly wholesome family was effectively a prison for all 4 of the children. In the early 2010s, a TV show called Wife Swap was making waves. In the show, 2 families would swap wives or mothers for a few weeks. The families were usually very different from each other to highlight the diversity of family life in America and to use the tension and conflict that would inevitably occur for comedic and dramatic effect. The Stockdale boys begged their parents to participate in the show. In 2008, Kathy and Tim made the fateful decision to agree. Little did Kathy know, she just started a sequence of events that would culminate in her brutal murder. When the producers of Wife Swap saw the Stockdale way of life, they knew they had solid TV gold on their hands. They'd also gotten in touch with the Tonkovich family in Illinois, who were basically the polar opposites of the Stockdales. Lori Tonkovich didn't impose any rules on her children. They would wake up whenever they wanted, wear whatever they wanted, and eat a diet consisting mostly of fast food. Needless to say, when Lori swapped places with Kathy, she was shocked by just how strict the mother of the household could be, especially when she read about the routine the boys had to follow. After being woken up at 7:30, the boys had exactly 4 minutes to get to the breakfast table. Otherwise, they'd be fined 25 cents. They'd then perform all sorts of chores on the farm and in the house. If they completed their chores with a so-called glad heart, which is to say they didn't complain about how hard they were forced to work, they'd get tokens that they could exchange for little pleasures like listening to a family-friendly radio show under strict supervision. After finishing their chores, the boys gathered together for homeschooling. They couldn't even get out of the house to study, which meant they had basically no contact with other kids their age. Kathy possibly taught them a very Christian-oriented syllabus, which meant less of a focus on science and facts and more on biblical stories. Before continuing this video, if you want to become part of our family, subscribe to this channel and enjoy daily crime cases that no one dares to speak about. During the show, Lori got so upset when she saw how the boys were living that she broke down in tears. She didn't realize this was going to be so hard. She wanted to have a good impact on the kids' lives, so she decided to introduce them to some of the things they'd missed out on. This meant setting up a cable TV connection and buying a video game console. The boys seemed excited about the games, but Jacob notably said he didn't see any value in what he was doing. James talked about how guilty he felt, but that he still loved playing video games. This also showed just how deep the indoctrination went in the Stockdale family. When Lori encouraged Jacob to watch some TV, he reportedly broke down crying and ran outside. Lori then followed him and asked him what was wrong, and the answer she got was as shocking as it was heartbreaking. Jacob said that he was worried about going to hell if he watched TV, even though Lori was most likely showing him wholesome family-oriented content. She tried her best to change how the Stockdales lived, but there was no chance they'd listen. They were far too set in their ways, and the fact that Tim was there to reinforce Kathy's rules didn't help matters much. As the episode drew to a close, Kathy and Lori had very different takes on what the experience had taught them. One thing anyone would notice is that Kathy had an extremely rigid personality. If she thought something was right, no one could convince her to change her mind. Even though Lori had been immersed in an environment that was so alien to her, Kathy seemed unable to even imagine a life that wasn't as regimented or controlled as the one she made her kids live. Tim's unwavering support meant that she had no one to criticize her, and there's a good chance that many, if not most, of the rules came from the family patriarch himself. The Stockdales' experience with wife swap in 2008 didn't seem to change anything, at least on the surface. Years went by, and the boys finally started leaving home and living independently. Calvin went off to Hillsdale College in Michigan, far away from his parents' influence, and started working as a teacher at the institute. His younger brother Charles headed to Philadelphia to become a med student. It is important to note that the boys didn't choose to go to college in Ohio. They traveled thousands of miles away, which seemed to suggest that they were running from something or perhaps someone. By 2017, only 26-year-old Jacob and 21-year-old James were still living with their parents. They were old enough to leave, and it's intriguing that they didn't because it adds more mystery to the events that followed. Why didn't Jacob, the man in his mid-22nd, just move away from the family home? There's an explanation for James deciding to stay. He was studying business at a nearby university and had dreams of managing the family band one day. But as for Jacob, one has to wonder why he didn't just start a life of his own. The Stockdale family band kept going, albeit without the involvement of Calvin or Charles. It became a trio and continued to perform at events across the state, amassing a decent following and even recording a few albums. But apart from that, there was simply no reason for Jacob to stay in the tiny town of Beach City. It's possible that this was the whole problem. Jacob had nowhere to go. He might not even have known who he was, and even though he might have seemed perfectly all right on the outside, inside a sense of turmoil had started to build, and it would soon erupt in a bloody explosion of violence. At around 4:36 on June 15, 2017, Stark County Police received a 911 call that ended with the caller suddenly hanging up. This prompted them to head to the Stockdale residence, where the call had come from, to investigate the suspicious occurrence. When they arrived, they heard a loud bang and rushed into the home. That's when they saw Jacob with a shotgun wound to his head. He was still alive, but barely so, and the presence of the firearm next to him meant that the wound was almost certainly self-inflicted. Police headed upstairs to continue their search, and when they entered the bathroom, they found Kathy and James lying dead on the floor, their bodies mangled by massive sprays of shotgun pellets. Tim was luckily outside of the home at the time, but he was understandably devastated when he found out there was only one reasonable explanation for what happened. Jacob had killed his mother and brother, and then tried to take his own life. However, his self-inflicted gunshot wound meant that he needed urgent medical attention. He was taken to a local hospital, where doctors treated his would have tried to understand why he would have done such a thing. When Calvin found out about his mother and little brother getting murdered, he released a statement saying, "James, our youngest brother, has always been a catalyst of family fun. Aside from being a gifted musician, James enjoyed dancing and had an innate love of people. James was working on a business degree and hoped to go to the business side of entertainment. He leaves behind many friends and a family that loves him dearly." Tim also released a statement which read, "Kathy has been my beloved wife of 32 years and a wonderful mother to our 4 sons. She loved nothing more than being a mother and grandmother. She had a strong love of learning and was passionate about her Christian faith, natural health, and organic farming." In both statements, it seemed like Tim and Calvin were intentionally avoiding mentioning their brother. In fact, the only cursory acknowledgement of what Jacob had done came from an earlier statement from Calvin, in which he thanked the medical center that treated him, though he didn't mention him. Jacob was seriously wounded after his suicide attempt. He lost sight in his left eye and suffered serious brain damage, which cast some doubts on whether he'd be fit to stand trial. Police decided not to charge him until he had fully recovered from his injuries, which led to over a year of uncertainty about what would happen next. On September 26, 2018, Stark County Police finally charged Jacob with 2 counts of first-degree murder, and his bail was set at $1 million. On October 9th, Jacob's defense attorney filed a motion to determine his competency to stand trial. Jacob pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, and was sent to Heartland Behavioral Health Hospital for observation. Jacob spent over a year at Heartland, where doctors constantly tried to test his mental competency. They held mock trials where they used legal terminology and attempted to assess if Jacob understood how the court system worked. The culprit also made 2 escape attempts during his stint at the Mental Health Institute. The first occurred in November of 2019 when he tried to hide behind a stack of books until he was caught. 2 months later, Jacob tried blending in with a crowd of people leaving the institute, but he was caught once again. This showed that he had enough mental competence to stand trial, but it would take more than this to convince the court. His sanity hearings were postponed multiple times due to the pandemic, and it wasn't until September of 2020 that he appeared in court via video link. Jacob's silence in court may have stemmed from a fear of technology or as a tactic for an insanity plea, but it proved ineffective. Eventually deemed fit for trial by a psychologist, his trial was delayed due to the pandemic. Meanwhile, the Stockdale family pleaded for leniency after he killed Kathy and James. On April 28, 2021, Jacob pleaded guilty, receiving a 15-year sentence for each murder with parole eligibility in 2048. His family's forgiveness appears rooted in their Christian values. The motive remains unclear, but some psychologists theorize that Kathy's obsessive-compulsive tendencies affected Jacob. Her strict control over their routines and diet, focused on organic living, may have exacerbated his mental health issues. Kathy's belief that leisure was sinful left Jacob with no personal identity. Theories suggest he either snapped from perceived abuse or wanted to spare James from the same life. A video of Jacob and James singing before the murders highlights their bond, which may have tragically influenced Jacob's actions. What are your thoughts on this case? Was the sentence appropriate? Or did his upbringing contribute to his crimes? Share your views in the comments, and if you enjoy our content, like and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you for watching.